Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about this video that somewhat piqued my interest. And this video is going to be by the boxing channel known as Fannon International Boxing. And I like to tend to review his videos when it comes down to it because even though I don't necessarily agree with him on everything, I do think that at least he has more of a logical and sound mind than that of some of the other channels that I tend to review. And all in all, I just think that he may have an interesting perspective on certain things. But before I get into the video overall, I did want to give out a big thank you to all the people who watch the content and overall watch my videos and thumbs up the videos and may leave overall comments no matter what they be. I certainly appreciate anyone's opinions out there. And of course, I have a big thank you overall to all the most recent subscribers to my channel. It certainly helps out a lot, and I appreciate it a great amount. And hopefully, for those of you guys overall that may celebrate Christmas or any sort of holidays out there as of recent, hopefully you guys are having a peaceful time with your friends, your family, yourself, whoever you may celebrate it with. And hopefully y'all are having a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend. But anyways, just heading straight into the video. This video overall is going to talk about a possibility of there being an Errol Spence Jr. versus Saul Canelo Alvarez fight a little bit later on down the line. But apparently, at least according to Fannon International Boxing, he says that there is a source that says that if Errol Spence Jr. cannot get the Terrence Bud Crawford fight next year, that he may go straight into the Saul Canelo Alvarez fight. Now, how realistic this is, or how serious this is, I'm not necessarily sure. However, do I believe that boxing will eventually try to set up an Errol Spence Jr. versus Canelo Alvarez fight, especially if Errol Spence Jr. still remains undefeated or maybe does not get that fight with Terrence Bud Crawford? I do believe that eventually they will try to set that fight up. There's been a multitude of hints for that fight. I think all in all that they are going to eventually try to set up that super fight because Errol Spence Jr. is probably the biggest star at the welterweight division, and Canelo, of course, at least as of right now, is the biggest star in all of boxing. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see what happens with that. Anyways, Fanon's going to talk about it. Let's get into it.
All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fannon. In this video, we're going to talk about Errol Spence Jr., Terrence Crawford, and a chance that Errol Spence Jr.'s actual end goal for his career might come sooner than later, depending on what Terrence Crawford does. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fannon. Before I get into the subject matter of the video, let me wish you happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Hanukkah, whatever it is that you celebrate during this holiday season. I hope that you, your family, your loved ones all have a absolutely wonderful and blessed time. Also, if you would not mind, make sure to support my sponsor for this video and our betting partner, busr.ag /Fannon. If you go there and you enter the promotional code Fannon, when you deposit money when you bet on boxing, basketball, or whatever it is, you're going to get special benefits and special credits there. So definitely a good way to get extra value if you use my promotional code over there. So please accept my invitation to do so. All right, man, let's get to it. Had a conversation with people that are close, not in the Errol Spence Jr. camp, I've had people on the Errol Spence Jr. camp that have been on my channel before. I want to be very, very clear that it is not them that I'm getting this from. It is somebody from a completely different angle. However, I definitely thought that this information was worth sharing with you. Just to keep in your mind, may pan out this way, may not pan out this way. And actually, I hope that it does not pan out this way. And that is that, Errol Spence Jr., because he has mega fights that he is looking for the rest of his career. He's not, and he has said this himself out in public records. You can check this. He's saying, look, man, he's not looking for tune-up fights. He's looking to go, straight into championship fights. The one he's got right now is Yordenis Ugas. And then after that, he's on record saying that he's trying to clean up the 147-pound division. And that would mean that he wants to get a fight with Terrence Crawford and become the undisputed champion at 147 pounds. There are, however, issues around, from my understanding, within the PBC, and this is something that people from the Terrence Crawford, on the Terrence Crawford side of it, say, right? You know, that there may be people over there that are not as anxious for him to fight Terrence Crawford, and actually they have bigger plans for Errol Spence Jr. in his career. And seeing as he's just had a car accident, he's had a retina injury, that, you know, that there's feelings that they might want to speed that up. And that is the ultimate end goal. My understanding is, and this has been said by people in Errol Spence Jr.'s camp before, and it is something that is not, you know, really not talked about a lot, is that the ultimate fight for Errol Spence Jr. is a pay-per-view showdown with Canelo Alvarez. Now, the reason why that is...
I personally do believe that that is the eventual end game for Errol Spence Jr. as well. But what I will say is this: I do think that if Errol Spence Jr. is going to get that Canelo Alvarez fight, I think that he probably should wait on it. Because sometimes when people go up to weight classes and, you know, they're really fighting someone that not only is out of their weight, but is highly, highly skilled, sometimes that can be a career ender. Sometimes with like a Kell Brook and a Gennady Golovkin, or someone like with a Mikey Garcia, Errol Spence Jr., or a Guillermo Rigondeaux versus Vasily Lomachenko. I don't think that any of those fighters were ever the same after they took that ass whooping that they did from those fighters, whether it be mentally or physically. So if Errol Spence Jr. is going to face Canelo Alvarez, no problem. But in my opinion, he probably should wait it out. I think that if Errol Spence Jr. is going to possibly face Canelo Alvarez, I believe that at first, his main target should be the winner of that Brian Castano versus Jermell Charlo fight. I think that either of those would be a super fight. You know, it may even actually be bigger if it were Errol Spence Jr. versus Brian Castano, because of course Brian Castano, he has an amateur win over that of an Errol Spence Jr., but who knows? Jermell Charlo is a pretty decently big star, so we'll see. But that rematch, in my opinion, could really go either way. It would be very, very interesting. But anyways, Errol Spence Jr., in my opinion, he does have to watch out with this fight. I'm not saying that maybe he should not take the fight, even though in my opinion, I think that Canelo more than likely probably would win quite definitively. But Errol Spence Jr., he may have a shot, because I do think that he isn't a great boxer. I do think that it would be a super fight. But if he is going to face Canelo Alvarez, I'm not quite sure if I would do it within the next two fights. If that Canelo Alvarez fight does happen, it probably is going to have to happen maybe even a few years later on down the line. But we'll see what happens.
Such an attractive fight is for several reasons. Errol Spence Jr. has been on record as saying that he believes that he can fight Canelo Alvarez, and that really Canelo Alvarez, if you look at the frame on Canelo Alvarez, that his frame is not that much bigger than Errol Spence Jr.'s is. That when he looks at Canelo, he's looking at Canelo eye to eye. The Canelo's a little bit
Well, they might be similar in terms of height, but stature-wise, in terms of thickness and in terms of build, Canelo Alvarez is very, very big overall for 160. He's a person that he's going to be very heavy compared to that of an Errol Spence Jr. I don't know where Errol Spence Jr. necessarily rehydrates. Maybe he even rehydrates all the way up to 170. That's a possibility. Canelo, at his minimum, probably rehydrates at about a good 185. So that means that even Canelo heading into that fight, he may have a 15-pound weight advantage over Errol Spence Jr. So it's going to be very, very interesting.
Is more stocky than he is, but he believes that he is somebody that is not too big for him to fight. Also, if you've listened to, and this is not Derek James talking about Canelo, this is just Derek James talking about, not talking about Canelo as it relates to Errol Spence Jr., but talking about Canelo as it relates to, other fighters, that, when Canelo Alvarez moved up in weight, that the big advantage that Canelo Alvarez has over other fighters is that Canelo Alvarez has a speed advantage over bigger fighters. And when you fight, and that would be the case with all smaller fighters that move up in weight, for example.
Well, at certain times, yes. Just like a Manny Pacquiao. Manny Pacquiao, when it comes down to it, a big advantage that he usually would have, even sometimes against that of the bigger stature fighters, is not only that he had a great punching power, but he also had very decent hand speed, very excellent hand speed, but not just his hand speed. You can't just have excellent hand speed and beat some A-grade opponents. You also have to have elite foot speed. You also have to have very great feet. Canelo, in my opinion, like I said, sometimes I think that he does need to work on his feet, but his feet definitely are not bad. He does have quicker feet than what he used to, in my opinion. He has worked on his footwork when it comes down to it. And Canelo's head movement and his movement, all in all, is just very, very good. And on top of that, he is an A-grade defensive fighter. He is very, very excellent defensively at this point in time in his career. Now, if it were a Terrence Bud Crawford versus Canelo Alvarez, I could maybe understand an advantage, at least in the movement category, for Terrence Bud Crawford, at least with his feet, because you can debate, in my opinion, that Terrence Bud Crawford has debatably the fastest feet in all of boxing. At least he's up there for that debate. But when it comes down to it, all in all, Errol Spence Jr., in my opinion, he does not really have the fastest of feet. I don't think that he has necessarily bad footwork, but he does not have elite, fast feet. I think a big part of the reason why Floyd Mayweather Jr. is able to beat Saul Canelo Alvarez is not only because he's such a defensively responsible fighter, but Floyd was able to be faster than that of a Canelo Alvarez, and he was just very hard to hit. He was faster with his feet by a decent amount. He was faster with his hand speed by a decent amount. And that's pretty hard to do over Saul Canelo Alvarez. But Errol Spence Jr., I don't know one advantage that he's going to have over Canelo Alvarez, and that's why this fight is so dangerous for him, because he's not going to have the feet advantage, at least in terms of foot speed over Canelo. I don't think he's even going to have the head movement over Canelo. I don't even think that, even with him being the lighter fighter, I don't even think that he has the hand speed over Canelo Alvarez. And Errol Spence is an extremely accurate puncher. He's not the slowest puncher, but he's not extremely fast. So we'll see what Errol Spence Jr. is able to do. It'll be very, very interesting.
When Manny Pacquiao was giving advice to Mikey Garcia, or was asked, what can Mike...
So for those of you that may ask, well, do you think that Errol Spence Jr. even has the slightest chance against Canelo? Well, of course he has a decent chance. He's an A-grade fighter. Whenever you have an A-grade fighter against another A-grade fighter, there's always a chance that that fighter could beat the other fighter, no doubt about it. There's always a chance that anything can happen in boxing. It's the sport of boxing. Or really almost anything in sports. We've seen many upsets, like Sugar Ray Leonard, of course, was able to defeat Marvin Hagler. Floyd Mayweather Jr. was able to defeat Canelo Alvarez and Oscar De La Hoya. But they had certain advantages over those fighters, in my opinion, that those bigger fighters did not have. Like Sugar Ray Leonard, he had the clear hand speed and foot speed over Marvin Hagler. And I think overall that was a big part of the reason why he was able to defeat Marvin Hagler. When I take a look at Errol Spence Jr., I think that he's a smaller version of Marvin Hagler. And he's about as speedy as Marvin Hagler was. Because Marvin, even though I think that he was an all-time great fighter, he didn't really come across to me as someone that was A-grade in the speed category, at least from what I've seen. Now, I haven't watched a whole lot of Marvin, but that overall is just what I've seen. So it is what it is. So Canelo against Errol Spence Jr., in my opinion, even though I do think it would be a super fight, I don't really know exactly how Errol Spence would be able to beat Canelo Alvarez. I think that Canelo is the better counterpuncher. I think that he has better head movement. I think that he has faster feet, all in all, at least debatably. I think that he has even the faster hand speed. And on top of that, he's just bigger in stature. I think also that he has, even debatably, that of the higher boxing IQ. And I think that he's even possibly more defensively responsible. So I don't see how Errol Spence personally would beat Canelo Alvarez. That's why, in my opinion, of Errol Spence, if he is going to beat Canelo Alvarez, he should probably try to adjust to the weight. Maybe get a fight with someone else before he faces Canelo Alvarez. At least that is more similar in size. So we'll see what happens.
Mikey Garcia do to beat Errol Spence Jr. He said, well, you're the smaller guy. You're going to have to use speed to your advantage because it's the smaller guy's speed that is the advantage over the bigger guy, right?
That is true. When you're the smaller fighters, you are going to have to use speed to your advantage. You're also going to have to use angles. You're going to have very decently fast feet like a Manny Pacquiao or like a Alexander Usyk or like a Vasily Lomachenko or Terrence Bud Crawford, people who have elite feet, people who can work you at almost any angle, people who can get in and inside out pretty quickly. I don't think that Errol Spence Jr. is the type of fighter to do that. He can work certain angles, but he's not a person all in all that, can jump in and out overall super duper quick. He's a person that, in my opinion, he's either going to pressure you overall, and that's going to be the main game plan, or he's going to try to outbox you from the outside. I don't think that he can work Canelo Alvarez from a certain amount of angles. Now, maybe I'm wrong. I think that Errol Spence, he is an A-grade boxer. He has an A-grade skill set. I don't think there's any, debate about that. But in order to beat Canelo Alvarez, if you're Errol Spence Jr.'s size, you have to have quick feet, in my opinion. And I just don't know if Errol Spence Jr. has that foot speed to defeat Canelo Alvarez. But we'll see what happens.
So you see Canelo Alvarez moving.
And for the people that may ask the question, well, do you think Errol Spence can beat Canelo Alvarez on the inside? Absolutely not. I think Errol Spence, he's very good on the inside. Canelo is going to be bigger. He's going to be the stronger puncher. And on top of that, he's going to be more defensively responsible and just have more punching power. I don't see how Errol Spence Jr. beats Saul Canelo Alvarez. I could maybe see Terrence Crawford pulling off the upset. Maybe, just because he has excellent foot speed. And even then, I'd give Terrence Crawford about a 20% chance. But Errol Spence Jr., I just don't think that he's the right type of style to beat Canelo.
Up in weight class, and what his big advantage is his hand speed. And the fact that he is a naturally smaller guy, shorter arm.
And that's why Mikey Garcia, that's why he got his ass kicked over Errol Spence Jr. Because even though Mikey Garcia, he can work at angles really, really good, Mikey Garcia is not known for his A-grade foot speed. Mikey Garcia, he's almost like someone that is a slower version of like Saul Canelo Alvarez, actually. That's what he reminds me of.
Punches get there quicker than the taller, longer guys, the taller guys that have longer arms, right? So the same logic goes forward with Errol Spence Jr. and Canelo. And also, not just that aspect of it, if you look at who Canelo Alvarez actually has to fight in the big mega fights that Canelo Alvarez would have down the line, there aren't any real big fights for Canelo Alvarez outside of Errol Spence Jr. And by that I mean, now there are big fights for Canelo Alvarez because when Canelo Alvarez,
I would somewhat agree with that. And Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion, he really is right now the bright, white shining superstar. And when I say white shining superstar, I'm talking about when someone says, that someone is so popular or they're burning so bright that they're white hot, which is hotter than that of red when it comes down to it, basically meaning that that's how big of a star they are at this current moment in time. Canelo Alvarez, he is the biggest star in all of boxing right now. And if him and Errol Spence Jr. were to have a pay-per-view fight, it definitely would do over 1 million pay-per-view buys, no doubt about it in my opinion. But I just don't know how well Errol Spence Jr. would do in that fight.
Is in a fight, it's a big fight, right? But, for example, he fights Caleb Plant. He does, they said 800,000, 600, 800,000, whatever it is. But obviously does very good numbers with Caleb Plant. That's a big fight.
I believe actually he did over 900,000 buys, which, like I said, for that fight, now maybe it was because it was a complete unification fight. Those are pretty extraordinary numbers for fighting a guy that, in Caleb Plant, in my opinion, wasn't a great fighter. But he's not a person that, is a superstar in the sport of boxing in terms of notoriety. Now, to be honest with you, I don't know if a lot of those boxers are within the 160 to 168 pound divisions or 175 pound divisions. Canelo can make a lot of those fights possibly anywhere from the 700,000 to maybe even over 1 million pay-per-view buys kind of fights because Canelo is a Mexican superstar and they usually get a lot of backing and they have a very, very big fan base. But when it comes down to it, there's just really no other superstars in terms of boxing. Now, when I say superstar, I'm not talking about A-grade fighters. I'm talking about in terms of, they could possibly sell a fight on their own, at least, a big fight, and get maybe 500,000 to something pay-per-view buys, or even like 300,000 pay-per-view buys. There's no person overall that's like that. Unless, there was a Jamal Charlo versus Demetrius Andrade super fight, or maybe David Benavidez facing one of those other guys. Those are the biggest superstars there. Probably a Jamal Charlo and a David Benavidez. So Canelo overall, I do think that it would behoove him to eventually fight them. And I do think overall that he is going to be looking at them because I think he knows that eventually those are going to be very, very big fights.
If he fights David Benavidez, it's going to be a big fight, right? Because every fight with Canelo Alvarez is going to be a big fight. However, if you look at Canelo Alvarez's numbers, Canelo Alvarez is not having a fight that is as big as a Floyd Mayweather Jr. Manny Pacquiao fight. It's not as big as a fight where you would get like, an Oscar De La Hoya Felix Tito Trinidad fight, right? There is, and in fact,
I would somewhat agree with that, but it's extremely hard to get to that level because for Floyd and Manny Pacquiao to get to that level, they had to face a lot of superstars when it came down to it. Certain guys like me, guys that would get 300,000 pay-per-view buys if they were in a big fight like Miguel Cotto or Shane Mosley or Oscar De La Hoya. Those are the type of guys that Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather Jr. were facing. Whether they were at the best point in their career or not, at least some people would argue. But, they beat them pretty decently at that point in time in their career. At least, Floyd did. Manny, in my opinion, he kind of beat Oscar De La Hoya when he was a little bit more wore down, and Shane Mosley, he was kind of done at that point in time in his career, but it is what it is. But anyways, when it comes down to it all in all, Manny Pacquiao and Floyd. I don't know if any other boxers, to be quite honest with you, are ever going to get to that point again, just in terms of pay-per-view buys. Canelo may have the opportunity, but even then, it's going to be extremely hard to get to their type of revenue level.
The only fight, two fights that he's had that have been like that have been a Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. fight and the Gennady Golovkin fights. But neither Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. or Gennady Golovkin really had a history of doing big pay-per-views or.
That's true. And that's also another thing, at least when you want to talk about making the same amount of numbers as Floyd and Manny Pacquiao. I don't know if Canelo is ever going to get to that level, especially within these weight divisions, because I just don't know if there's any superstars that people take a look at within 175 to 160 and really say, wow, those guys are going to do excellent on pay-per-views. Even some of the elite Eastern European fighters that may be very good fighters, like Artur Beterbiev or Gennady Golovkin, that may be somewhat hyped up, they just usually don't do extremely well with pay-per-view numbers. They just don't. It is what it is. So, we'll see what happens. But in my opinion, the two possibly biggest pay-per-view fights for Saul Canelo Alvarez, it probably would be Jamal Charlo and David Benavidez, at least within those lower weight classes. So we'll see what happens.
Really had a tremendously big fan base in the United States. Whereas somebody like Errol Spence, who is right now in the United States, other than Canelo Alvarez, is selling the most pay-per-views and probably has the biggest fan base of any fighter not named Canelo Alvarez that's fighting in the United States.
Him and Gervonta Tank Davis, in my opinion, because Gervonta Tank Davis, he has a very big growing fan base as well, even though his last pay-per-view did tank. But Gervonta Tank Davis, he usually does pretty decent on pay-per-views, at least from what I've seen.
Right, so those two coming together in a fight class, and at a weight somewhere around 160 pounds, 160, maybe 164-pound catch weight, is something that would do what Floyd Mayweather Jr. has done to really create do big events before, which is to have a Mexican fighter and an African American fighter with a big name come together and fight. So and this, honestly, I don't really need people, certain people to tell me that, or to convince me of that, because it's something you can just see where the tea leaves are coming together. However, what Errol Spence wants to do is he wants to first, and he's clearly on record saying this, is he wants to clear up 147. He wants to clean up 147 pounds. He wants the Terrence Crawford fight. However, if for some reason Terrence Crawford is not able to do that, they're not beyond just skipping to the next phase and actively looking for the Canelo Alvarez fight outside of the 160 pound, outside of the 140-pound division. So I think that it is incumbent it's incumbent on Terrence Crawford for Terrence Crawford to make that fight and to be financially reasonable to do that. Now, I have done a video before, and I'll say it again, that I do believe that fight is going to happen because, Al Heyman is the type of guy, and this is my understanding from people that have dealt with him before, is that there is so much value in that Terrence Crawford fight that they will be able to work something out where Terrence Crawford feels like he's been adequately rewarded. However,
we'll see about that. Once again, there's been a lot of criticism towards Errol Spence Jr., but I also need to see if Terrence Bud Crawford is serious about that fight, because once again, if he's just going to play this, bullshit pettiness to where apparently a 60-40 split is not enough, and that's the deal breaker, that'll tell me that Terrence Bud Crawford is not really super serious about that fight either.
That the actual big money goal for Errol Spence Jr. is not for him to stay at 147 pounds forever, but to actually get that Canelo Alvarez fight and make a mega fight, which they believe, if everything leads up to it, could be one of the biggest fights in boxing history. And that is, something that they're not going to shortcut the opportunity to make happen. Canelo Alvarez, for his part, has said that he'd be open to fight Errol Spence Jr. and eventually, more than likely, he's going to be able to and willing to do that, to make that type of mega fight. I don't know if they're going to risk themselves when they have an opportunity, and that's Canelo's side, risk themselves against the Benavidez's and these guys when they can see that big cash money prize right in front of them in a fight that they're going to be, number one, that they're going to be favored to win. This Canelo Alvarez is going to be favored to win Errol Spence Jr., and they may actually figure that because they're coming down in weight, actually be a cherry pick against a guy like like Errol Spence, a guy like Errol Spence Jr. But anyway, that's what I heard. My take on the matter is that I certainly hope that the Errol Spence Jr. Terrence Crawford fight is made, and then they move on to that. But it is what it is. We'll see what happens. You let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.
Anyways, that's really about it for today. But I thought that I would talk about that because I thought that that would be a little bit interesting. Do I think that the Errol Spence Jr. versus Canelo Alvarez fight will eventually happen? I think that it's possible, but we'll also see if Terrence Bud Crawford may get in the way. We'll also see where Errol Spence Jr.'s career is going to go, because I'm not necessarily sure where Errol Spence Jr. is going to go from here. I have a 50-50, kind of at least intuitive thought that there could be a possible chance that Errol Spence Jr., he could possibly lose to Terrence Bud Crawford, or maybe the injuries maybe have caught up with him. So we'll see what happens. But anyways, it'll be very, very interesting to see whatever happens. Hopefully we can see the Terrence Bud Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. fight soon. But if not, who knows? Maybe we will see an Errol Spence Jr. versus Jermell Charlo fight, or Brian Castano fight, or maybe we'll see a Canelo Alvarez fight. Could be very interesting. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.